Welcome back, my students. Dr. Oogway here, and today I bring you the video first from the playlist of Cerebellum. And in this video, we will study the introduction, the relations, and the external features of cerebellum. So let's begin with the introduction to cerebellum. Number first point in the cerebellum, it is the second largest part of brain. Second largest part of brain, and largest part in hindbrain. So this is the number first point in the introduction. Number second point, cerebellum maintains tone, it maintains posture, and it maintains equilibrium of body. Number third point in the introduction, it has a gray matter. We know brain has gray matter and white matter. The gray matter of cerebellum contains millions of neurons, clearly, in a very small space, or small area, clearly. This arrangement is called as arbor vitae, clearly. That means vital tree of life. So the gray matter of the cerebellum, it accommodates millions of neurons in a very small area. That's called as the arbor vitae, which means vital tree of life. Number fourth point, the structure of cerebellum is homotypical. What do you mean by homotypical structure? Homotypical means same throughout, or uniform throughout. While as if we compare the structure of the cerebellum to cerebrum, the structure of cerebrum is heterotypical, clearly. While as that's not same throughout, that's not uniform throughout, but the structure of cerebellum is homotypical, that's same throughout. Number fifth point that we will study here is it also contributes to precision, it contributes to coordination, and it contributes to accurate timing. Clearly, these are the 5 points about in the introduction of the cerebellum, clearly. So introduction is clear. One more point that we can add: in Latin, cerebellum means small brain, clearly. And the weight of the cerebellum is 150 grams. So number first point, it is the second largest part of the brain, it is the largest part of the hindbrain. It maintains tone, posture, and equilibrium of the body. The gray matter of the cerebellum contains millions of neurons in a very small area. This arrangement is known as arbor vitae, which means vital tree of life. And the structure of cerebellum is homotypical, which means uniform throughout. And it also contributes to the precision, coordination, and the accurate timing, clearly. And in Latin, cerebellum means small brain, and the weight of the cerebellum is 150 grams, clearly. So we clear introduction is clear. Now we move on to the relations of cerebellum. Relations, clearly. To understand relations, we will look at the diagram in the BDC, that's figure 6.2, relations of the cerebellum. This diagram, it's very easy to draw. Let me teach you how to draw this diagram. Clearly, figure 6.2 from the Neuroanatomy in BDC series. First, we will start a line, then we'll make a bulge, then we'll make another bulge and a line downwards, and another line down like this, and the third line but with the little bulge on the outward direction. And from here we will draw a big structure like this, clearly. On the superior side, we'll make a line like this, clearly. And from the inferior side, we'll make another line which goes like this, clearly. So this is the diagram figure 6.2 given in the BDC. Now we will name the different structures in this diagram. This structure right here is our point of discussion, that's cerebellum. This is pons. This is medulla oblongata, medulla. Here is midbrain. The superior side is tentorium cerebelli, and this right here is bone, occipital bone. This is the anterior side or the ventral side. This is the posterior side or the dorsal side, and this is the superior side, and this is the inferior side. Clearly, from this diagram, easy. Now this diagram, draw this diagram. Now everything is clear. What is anterior to cerebellum? What is anterior to cerebellum? Is pons and medulla. Simple. What is superior to cerebellum? Is tentorium cerebelli. Superior to cerebellum is tentorium cerebelli. What is this tentorium cerebelli? It is a modification of the dura mater, meningeal layer of dura mater. I have taught you this tentorium cerebelli in detail in the meningeal playlist. Go watch it if you want to. Clearly, if you don't want to watch it, for time being, remember tentorium cerebelli is the superior relation to the cerebellum. Similarly, this is the inferior side. This is the posterior side. So posterior inferiorly, we have another structure, that's occipital bone. Occipital bone. So relations of the cerebellum is clear. Occipital bone. This cerebellum is located in posterior cranial fossa. Posterior cranial fossa. We know our brain is present in a cranium, that's the cranial cavity. This cranial cavity has anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa. This posterior cranial fossa holds cerebellum. Cerebellum. So the relations of the cerebellum is clear. Now we move on to the external features. Most important topic of this lecture, external features of cerebellum. External features. External features of cerebellum. Clearly, our cerebellum has a superior surface and an inferior surface. Clearly, and our cerebellum has two hemispheres, which are connected by vermis. Now we will draw this. So in external features, remember 2 points. We have a superior surface and the inferior surface of cerebellum. Clearly, and this cerebellum also has two hemispheres which are connected by the vermis. We will understand the superior and the inferior surface of cerebellum with the diagram that's given in BDC figure 6.3a and b. So let's learn how to draw this diagram. Clearly, so first we will make a pillar like structure. This is a pillar like structure. From here we'll continue a line like this to here, and from here we'll continue a similar line like this to here. Clearly, so this is the superior surface of cerebellum. Superior surface. Now we will draw the inferior surface. Clearly, now we will draw the inferior surface. For inferior surface, we'll draw another pillar-like structure in this manner. Clearly, and from here we'll make a structure like this, and from here we'll make another line like this. Clearly, and from here we'll make a line like this, another line like this, and another line here, and another line here, and the endpoints will be joined by this. Clearly, this is the inferior surface. So this is the superior surface of cerebellum, and this is the inferior surface of cerebellum. So as you can see in the superior surface as well as in the inferior surface, our cerebellum has two hemispheres. This is the first hemisphere and this is another hemisphere. This is the first hemisphere, this is another hemisphere. These two hemispheres are connected by vermis. So this pillar that I made is vermis. This is the one hemisphere, this is another hemisphere, it is connected by vermis. So that's what I told you. Two hemispheres connected by vermis, and we have the superior and the inferior surface. And the inferior surface. Clearly? So this is the anterior side, this is the posterior side, and this is another, again the anterior side. Now I will show you how is this superior surface and inferior surface. Clearly? So consider here. This is the superior surface, and this is the anterior side. Clearly? We are looking from the top view. Then when it reaches to the here, clearly, then it continues downwards, below this page. It continues below. like this. It continues below like this, like this. We have the inferior surface. So this is the posterior, this is again the posterior, then it continues, and this is the anterior. This anterior is actually below this anterior. You got my point? It's like this. Clearly, it's like this. It's like this. So anterior, then we have the posterior. This posterior continues downwards. Clearly, and this is the, and this is the anterior. This anterior is actually below this anterior. This is the inferior surface, and this is the superior surface. So you got it? Superior and the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Superior and the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Now this superior and the inferior surface of the cerebellum is divided into three lobes. Is divided into three lobes by three fissures. By three fissures. Now we will name these three fissures and these three lobes. Number first fissure is called as the primary fissure. It is present on the superior surface right here. So this line that I made, what is this? This is primary fissure. Primary fissure. Clearly, it divides the superior surface into the uh, anterior lobe, and this is the posterior lobe. Posterior lobe. Clearly, now this posterior lobe continues. So this whole is also the posterior lobe. This is the posterior lobe. This is the posterior lobe. Clearly, you know why? Because you got it. Clearly, it continues then downwards. It continues below, like this. Clearly, so this is the primary fissure. Clearly, this is the anterior lobe. This is the posterior lobe. Then it continues below. It continues below. It continues below. So this is also the posterior lobe. This is also the posterior lobe. Clearly. So this is the posterior lobe. This is also the posterior lobe. Clearly. So anterior lobe and the posterior lobe is divided by the primary fissure. Primary fissure. Clearly. So number second. Here we have the another structure that I forgot to. In the inferior surface, we have two bulges like this. Number first bulge and the number second bulge. Number second bulge. Clearly. This right here, this part right here is called as the nodule. Clearly. And this part right here, is called as the flocculus. Flocculus. Clearly. Flocculus. Together this part and this flocculus is called as the floccular nodular lobe. Clearly, floccular nodular lobe. Floccular nodular lobe. So the three lobes we know in the cerebellum, we have three lobes. Number first lobe is the anterior lobe. Then we have here the posterior lobe, which continues. So this is also the posterior lobe. Then we have here the third lobe, that is the floccular nodular lobe. Floccular nodular lobe. Floccular nodular lobe. It is separated from the posterior lobe. So the posterior lobe is up to here. Posterior lobe is up to here. It is separated from the posterior lobe by this fissure. You know, by this area. This is known as posterior-lateral fissure. Posterior-lateral fissure. Posterior-lateral fissure. So far we have three lobes. What are those three lobes? Anterior lobe, then we have the posterior lobe, and we have flocculonodular lobe. Flocculonodular lobe. Clearly. And we have three fissures. Number first, we have the primary fissure. Clearly. Another fissure that we talk about is the posterior-lateral fissure. Posterior-lateral fissure. And there is one more fissure that's called as the horizontal fissure. That's right here. Horizontal fissure. Horizontal fissure. What is this horizontal fissure? It divides the superior surface and inferior surface. Inferior surface. It divides superior surface and inferior surface. As you can see from here, what is this? This is the superior surface. Clearly. And it is divided from the inferior surface by crease. This crease. This is the horizontal fissure. This is the horizontal fissure. Clearly. So this is the diagram. Now let's write it down. Now let's write it down. So what we have here, we have three lobes. We have here the anterior lobe. Clearly. We have here the middle lobe, which is also known as the posterior lobe. Clearly. And we have the another lobe that's called as the flocculonodular lobe. Flocculonodular lobe. Clearly. And we have the three fissures. What are those fissures? Number first, we have here the primary fissure. Primary fissure that divides the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Clearly. Then we have the second fissure, that's the horizontal fissure. This horizontal fissure divides the superior surface and the inferior surface. Superior surface and the inferior surface. This crease right here is the horizontal fissure. Horizontal fissure. Clearly? And right here, this part right here is the posterior lateral fissure. Posterior lateral fissure, because it divides, it separates posterior lateral, it separates the posterior lobe from the flocculonodular lobe, posterior lateral fissure. So the third fissure is posterior lateral fissure. So these three fissures divides the cerebellum into these three lobes. Clearly? Now, as you can see from this diagram, this posterior lobe, this is the posterior lobe, this is also the posterior lobe, this is the largest lobe. Clearly? And is present on both the surface. It is also present on the superior surface, it is also present on the inferior surface. So first point, this middle lobe is largest and is present on both surfaces. Clearly? This is the flocculus, this part, and this part, and this is the nodule. This is the flocculonodular lobe. This is the smallest. So this flocculonodular lobe is the smallest. Lobe. Clearly? So, and this flocculonodular lobe, where is it present? It is present on the inferior surface. Just in front of the posterior lateral fissure. This is the posterior lateral fissure, and in front, because anterior to it is the anterior to posterior lateral fissure. This is the posterior lateral fissure. This part, anterior to it is the flocculonodular lobe. So this is all about the cerebellum. So we talked about the introduction, we talked about the relation, we talked about the external features of the cerebellum. We can see this from the diagram. So this is the diagram, this is the superior surface and this is the inferior surface. Clearly, you can see all the structures right there clearly, and this is the diagram of the cerebellum, cadaveric image. And we can see there's one more diagram in the BDC, that's figure 6.1. As you can see from here, this diagram, this is the pons, this is the medulla, behind it is the cerebellum. Clearly? So first we start right here and we come to the fissura prima, that's called as the primary fissure. Here is the primary fissure. Clearly? Then we have here the posterior lobe. Clearly? And right here we have the posterior lateral fissure and the flocculonodular lobe. So this completes our first video of the cerebellum. Thank you very much. I'll get back to you with another lecture.